Call to order the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission regular meeting. Today is December 12, 2017. First item on the agenda today is roll call. Let the record show that Commissioners Freeman and Ustinson are not present. Second item is the approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion?
I move that we approve the minutes from the November 28th, 2017 regular Planning Commission meeting.
I second it.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Okay. Motion's approved. Item 3, the public comment part of our meeting, where we allow 15 minutes for anybody to make public comment on anything otherwise not on the agenda for the Planning Commission meeting. Do I have any takers in the audience? Seeing none, I close that portion of our meeting. Item 4 is our public hearings. Let the record show that the transportation concurrency public meeting has been moved to a future meeting. Second on the public hearings list this evening is the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendments Docket. This is a public meeting. We'll call on Senior Planner Kat Kamak to walk us through this.
Good evening, thank you. Have just a short presentation on the 2018, the items that are moving forward on the preliminary docket for the 2018 amendments. So items that are currently tracking are the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, which is something that we started in 2017. We're still continuing to work on it. We'll have some work in the initial part of 2018. So it's a carryover. We have a lot more work to do on that in terms of doing level of service and talking about the 6-year plan and projects that we want to accomplish over the next 6 years. So it'll be an exciting time, at least in the first half of 2017, covering that. We have currently tracking also is the economic development element. This was also an item that was on the 2017 docket. If you remember, if the Planning Commission remembers the last meeting, we added one policy for the 2017 amendment to strengthen the connection between the CIP and the economic development projects. So we've added that, but again, it's tracking with the idea that some of the brainstorming ideas that came from an ad hoc committee to generate economic development benefits for Oak Harbor is still kind of being pondered over, and there may be some things that may come from it that we may want to consider as a policy. So it's tracking right now for the 2018 docket. What's also tracking is the JPA/UGA resizing. And maybe this needs to be retitled. The UGA resizing maybe can be taken out. This is kind of like related to, initially I think this item was on the 2017 docket because the county had it on their docket and they were considering doing some countywide planning policy amendments and expanding the JPA for planning reasons. At the same time, the rights annexation and rights crossing application was in as well. So those two were kind of looked at similarly. They are two separate issues, but they've been looked at kind of simultaneously. The county has made decision to take out the rights crossing from their docket and not consider it. And so it would be wise for us to also not have that aspect of it on our agenda. But the JPA discussion has been moved to their work program. And basically what that means, it's not on their docket, but they're going to be working on it. And we have some correspondence from the county saying we'd like to continue discussing the benefits of seeing whether the JPA can be expanded. And so that is currently also tracking. It'll be interesting when it gets to the city council level in terms of what they think should be on there and how we should address that. But we're keeping it just open so that we can have some discussion on it. But we can also consider removing it from the docket. It doesn't make sense if the county is not prepared to do anything on it and we have it on the docket, because ultimately the UGA and JPA is a combined effort with the county. So it doesn't help if we continue to discuss this without them having a part in it or having that part of their work program. So we'll have to continue talking about that. One of the suggestions that have come forward in the last few months, and this is mainly from issues raised in the community, City Council has discussed it, the Planning Commission has also discussed it, the general housing and affordable housing need in Oak Harbor and on Whidbey Island. So this is something that we updated in 2016 as part of our major update. We updated information from the census, we updated building permit information, we actually even noted some of the challenges that the community is facing currently in our comp plan, knowing that that's something that's coming forward. So with the county opening up their housing element for discussion, and housing and these issues don't respect borders necessarily. They're an issue island countywide, and therefore it's part of the city as city issues as well. And so combining our forces with the county may be helpful in the situation to address the problem countywide and see how the city can help with that overall issue on Island County. So that's also tracking for the 2018 docket. So the process of how the docket moves forward, the Planning Commission is familiar with this. We've done this annually. So what we're doing right now is just discussing the docket. Primarily, we want to have a public discussion about it. We notice it in the paper and so on. Some years we'll have input from the public, and some years we don't. But nevertheless, we go through the steps to do that. So we advertise the docket to the public. According to our code, the Planning Commission will hold a hearing on the in January. This time it's the 23rd, and make a recommendation to the City Council. We'll have a workshop on the docket with the City Council, discuss the same issues with them as well, get their input, and eventually the docket gets finalized in March. And then we have, as the Commission is familiar, we discuss the annual amendments almost in every meeting at the Planning Commission, and we make small strides forward, provide information, have discussion, and then we'll get into the hearing process again at the end of the year. So it's just a cyclical process. So that was just the gist of my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions or any other comments that the Commission has.
Regarding, could you go back to the previous slide? So the Wrights Crossing was removed from the county's docket, but my understanding is that the city, the Planning Commission, and the City Council have already addressed the Wrights Crossing application. It has been approved from the city, so there's not really anything else to discuss as far as Wrights Crossing goes. Is that correct?
That could be one way to look at it, in the sense that there have been some action taken by the City Council to at least state our position to the county. It's not necessarily that we approve anything, it's we state our position, because ultimately the UGA boundary is for the county. That's their line on a map to draw. So we provided our input on that. So
for example, if Wrights Crossing decides to go back to the county next year, that doesn't come to us again, right? Because the city's already weighed in on it.
the situations can change, the application can change, the methodology by which they want to do it can change, and those things can impact what we want to say about it. So I wouldn't say technically that, from here on, whatever they have to do is only county, and the city has no more say in it. I think if it does come back, if it rises up, there will be, based on at that time, we do have to probably provide input when it comes back again.
So then if we don't discuss it at the city level as part of our planned docket, that doesn't prohibit us from deciding that we're going to talk about it if, for example, their application was to
Yeah,
change.
it doesn't mean that we will never have a say in it.
Okay. And then the JPA-UGA resizing, I kind of agree with you that having the UGA part of it kind of confuses the issue because, again, the county, I think, somehow interprets it as being backwards for us to do it that way.
Yeah, the process, the rights crossing really made us, both the city and the county, think about the process by which we deal with, sponsored applications. That when we write the countywide planning policies, we're hoping the policies were written with the understanding that we'll visit UGA expansions or any expansions at our major cycles. They are 7-year cycles. We shouldn't have these emergency type expansions. That's what the policies are supposed to do. It's supposed to give us a long-term plan. So the policies were written with the idea that we'll talk about this every 7 years. If there's a sudden spike in population, then we'll initiate a discussion. So the word triggers, but it was mainly a discussion between city and county in terms of how to deal with the border. Rights crossing was a sponsored application, came from the private side, which not necessarily was really built. The process in the countywide planning policies was necessarily built to, from a process standpoint, to handle a rights crossing type application. So it was challenging from both city and county standpoint to try and see what would be the best way to deal with that. And so since the right crossing, I think there have been some changes that have been discussed in terms of how to address issues like that.
So back to the JPA resizing, though, I think that that's still something that we need to discuss.
It's on the county's work program, so I think they'll have some correspondence with us, and we should continue to discuss that. So just leaving it open for that opportunity and possibility.
I kind of think that we need to really relook at how the JPA is determined from scratch. Having some areas where the JPA is, practically adjacent to the UGA boundary, and then other areas of town where the JPA is miles away from the nearest UGA boundary, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it seems like maybe you should have a minimum of a mile buffer between the two to provide,
Yeah, there were some discussions. We did have some discussions when we went through the countywide planning policies on the JPA boundaries that was initially drawn when GMA plans were adopted. And, sometimes in addressing problems, we tend to think that the JPA is just a precursor to development and urban growth developing, but it's not necessarily the case. You draw lines to provide planning and sometimes prevent development. So including properties adjacent to the base is a good way to try and have some say for both city and county to have some policies in there to make sure that we don't encroach upon the Navy and prevent the operations as well. So there's many uses for the JPA. And the planning and also the resources that are within the JPA to be protected or converted. So they have many functions, the JPA, and yes, we could look at it. Either we can look at it to see if it needs to be amended, needs to be expanded, or if it's just best left alone. I mean, several issues can come up to facilitate discussion on that, and so it'll be interesting to, leaving it open is not necessarily going to be any, it's not going to do us any harm as long as we're not discussing anything in isolation of the county. That's the thing. It's like we can't try and get some things lined up from our side and not communicate with the county and expect them to all respond to us. So we'll have to do it in collaboration with them, I think, is what it is.
Yeah, I guess my main concern or fear is that by not putting it on our docket, does it send a message to the county that it's not a priority for us, when indeed it is a priority? That's all I have. Thank you.
On that same score, could you get a sense that the county has any sense of urgency about trying to work, I wouldn't say work with us, but at least see our side of things and what we would like to see happen, I guess? Because they put pressure, as I understand it, to get a commitment from the city and then all of a sudden they just drop it. I don't quite understand how that all came down.
I'll field that
Am
one.
I right or wrong?
Well, I think that the county certainly still has an interest in examining the JPA. Otherwise, they wouldn't have included it on their work program. And both CAC and I received the same letter from the planning director that wanting us to know that they had the JPA on their work program, and that they, I think, look forward to working with us in 2018 on it. So I expect that we will have serious conversations about the JPA. I also expect that there'll be easier conversations to have when you don't have an application pending. Just like it's hard to talk about a code amendment when you have an application pending, generally speaking, I think it was very difficult to have a conversation about how, if, where the JPA should expand when there was a pending application that needed that to take place in order for that even to be part of one of the next steps in that application. If you don't have a pending application, we can have the conversation about it from a planning perspective. And that'll probably be an easier conversation for the county, the city, and the community to have.
I want to weigh in that almost hit my points, point for point, on what I was going to talk about. I think it's critical for us to continue the JPA conversation. One of the main concerns I heard from stakeholders at the county during the discussions through the right crossing process was that they had no clear direction from this body prior to the application on doing any expansion or any changes to the JPA, and that would have gone a long ways. I think having a discussion at this level and a recommendation, or at least a vision from this body as to expanding that JPA outside of an application. So I think it's more critical than ever to have that conversation now, that application is off the table, and that we can kind of create a clear vision and direction that we would like to see the county move, so they have some input from our side.
The biggest thing that I would like to sit there and say, to me, I think it's a better process that it's not on the docket, that it continues to sit there and be discussed on the side, because it's still going to be discussed. But as far as being an official body where we'd be acting on it, first of all, we didn't act upon it because we were bypassed. We were not afforded that opportunity to have any kind of say-so in it. But under the same aspect, I think that it's very important that it continues on, because there was a lot of discussion with a lot of citizens on the infrastructure and other things as far as the planning that needs to be done. And for a massive community like that to be incorporated into the city or in the county and stuff like that, it needs to really be looked at on how are we going to do the infrastructure? Where are the roads going to go? How much do we need to widen out? How much water do we need to get down there? How much storage do we need for the water, for all of that? Because there's a lot of things we can do, but there are some things that if it's rushed, it's missed. And I've seen that in this city numerous times where projects have been done and have came through the city and it's been bypassed. And the citizens that lived in certain areas were totally upset about it because they had no input. And it affected them financially. And that's something that I think we need to sit there at times, slow down, and make sure we do go through the process that's already established.
Yeah, no, good points. One of the challenges with the right crossing and our ability to respond to the application when we do our comprehensive plans, whether it's be sewer, streets, wastewater, or whatever, we plan for the UGA, not for the JPA. Mm-hmm. So when you have a UGA application of that size and ask whether it could be served, well, guess what? Our plans don't cover that. So there are some real challenges in how the process works. How can we respond to an application when we don't have the plans that we adopt that cover past the UGA? That's what GMA says. You draw a boundary for the UGA, your potential growth area, and you plan for infrastructure within that. So when the UGA expansion comes forward, how can we respond in a week or two whether utilities comprehensively can be extended to these areas. It's hard to do within a short amount of time with all the master plans that you have. So there are some real practical difficulties that were identified when the rights crossing came through in terms of UGA expansions and how we do planning. So some of those limitations will still apply, and we have to determine what's practical and how we can make that work. But it's not simple and straightforward, especially for infrastructure. Can we solve it? Can we accommodate it? Can we take this on? We sometimes don't have the answer because it's not in our plans, so.
What I would like to see somewhere over the next year or sooner is some discussion, though, about does the current UGA boundary work for us? What are the limitations within that? And we've talked about some of them, but we talk about, for example, development costs on some of the infill properties. And I don't think anybody other than a few builders probably have a real good handle on what those costs are and why some of the infills not being developed. There's vacant parcels for sale that have been for sale for 10 years that nobody's building on. Why is that happening when we have a housing shortage? There's got to be reasons. And I don't think that we have a handle on what it is that's preventing speculators from building on those, from buying them and building.
Yeah, good question. I mean, we can discuss the issues within the UGA, but the actual UGA expansion itself, we do need to talk with the county on because we're partners.
Sure.
And we don't want to repeat what happened in 2005, where we go away, do our analysis, and say, hey, this is what we think happens, and they don't agree. I mean, that's how simple it could be,
But if
So
we
it
don't
is a
have
partnership.
a thorough discussion amongst ourselves about does this work for us, we can't talk intelligently when we do want to go forward and have the
That's true.
discussion on expansion.
Yeah, I think we do have in our comprehensive plan, I think some of the challenges we did identify when we did the countywide planning policies in the UGA capacity is the willingness of property owners to develop or not. So what we would normally have in the process of considering available land for development, it's in the capacity, and we do have capacity in the sense that there is land. But can we do anything about unwilling property owners? You can't write any policy or regulation to change that.
Well, and
can
that
we-
gets back to my point about if a property is for sale for 10 years, it would sell if the price was low enough. So
Well-
obviously the property owner isn't willing to do it. Exactly what you just said.
Yes, and so that's a challenge. No matter how much we expand or do the UGA, that issue is always going to be there, and it's hard to force or to develop a strategy when that unknown is there. We have market factors in this buildable. At least we talked about market factors. And making those market factors bigger because of all those unknowns. It's like, okay, we know we have capacity, but we can't predict. We can't write enough regulations. We can't provide enough incentives to sometimes move some of these properties into buildings. So there is some limitations on what we can do. So we increase that market factor to see if there's still capacity. So it's a good discussion. It's good to continue having that discussion. And like you said, it's good to have the information when that discussion does come up in terms of options and data, to speak intelligently about it. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kat. The next and final public hearing today is the Historic Preservation Ordinance. This is a public meeting, and Associate Planner Ray Lindenberg will help us out with this evening.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do tonight is just kind of a brief introduction on the process by which Oak Harbor is going to attempt to become a certified local government, and the reasoning behind that and the process that we'll go through to get there. And so I'll just go ahead and start real quickly with a little background on the process. We got a letter from the Main Street Association requesting that we take a look at becoming a certified local government. for a number of reasons, and I think we provided that letter as an attachment to your staff report tonight. Just going through and finding some technical assistance and some financial assistance for some of the property owners here in the city, specifically on Pioneer Way, but also could be applied anywhere within the city limits. And there is a pretty stringent process, a very guided process from the state on how to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, why become a certified local government? And the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation with the state, DAP, has come up with this process, and they're the ones who actually kind of administer the whole thing. And they provided a little checklist of the reasons why you would want to become a certified local government. And some of the benefits that they list in there is that you can get special grants from the State Historic Preservation Officer. There's local historic preservation expertise that's recognized by state and federal agencies. Technical assistance and training from the State Historic Preservation Office, the participation in nominations to the National Register of Historic Places, and participation in statewide preservation programs and planning are just a few of those. Now, the responsibilities for the certified local government, what do we have to do? What we need to do is maintain a historic preservation commission, survey local historic properties, enforce state or local preservation laws, provide for public participation, and other functions as delegated. So that kind of outlines what the benefits are and what our responsibilities are. Now, the process by which we become a certified local government is outlined again by DAP. And there are 3 steps that they show as those steps towards becoming a certified local government, a CLG. And they have it all outlined on their website. They have a whole bunch of information there. If you're interested, I strongly recommend going to that website and getting in there and going through the process and everything, because there is quite a lot of detail in there. Now, the first step in becoming a CLG is to adopt a historic preservation ordinance. DAP has provided a model ordinance that we can use, and our local staff architect, Gideon Kaufman, has gone through that process. He's done a whole bunch of work with this, and I want to recognize him in public right now because he's done a lot of work to get us to the point that we're at right now. Staff is continuing work on this portion of the project. What we're doing right now is we've taken the information that Gideon has provided to myself, and we're getting that organized into a full ordinance format that will fit into our code easily with the same formatting and everything, and references to the right code sections and all that sort of thing. So what's happening right now is we've taken that model ordinance, we've included Oak Harbor specific information, and then we're going to go through and review it, and we're going to send it around to staff and the legal department, make sure there's no obvious issues with it that are going to cause any kind of problems with our existing code, and make sure that it's going to be a good fit for Oak Harbor. So at the next hearing on the 23rd, we're going to have a draft to you for you to be able to take a look at and say, this looks good and we can move forward with it. I've set a fairly, I will say, assertive goal rather than an aggressive goal to have that to you on the 23rd and hopefully move it forward from that point. We're hoping that it's going to be clean enough and good enough at that point that you'll feel comfortable to provide a positive recommendation to the City Council. The very next day, we'll be going to the City Council for the workshop to discuss it with them. And then hopefully we'll be looking at the first part of March to actually get that to the City Council for approval. The reasoning behind that is we have a 60-day period that we have to go through SEPA to get a new ordinance in, and there's some other state mandated things that we have to provide to the state. So that's why that's kind of stretching out a little bit longer. So that first step there is to do the code, the draft of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Step 2, in part of the ordinance, is going to be talking about the Historic Preservation Commission. This commission will need to consist of at least one professional that meets the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards, and that would include somebody with a background in history, archaeology, or architecture. And after the creation of that commission, the group will work towards creating some bylaws and rules of procedure that will be established for the program. And again, there's guidelines that are set forth by the state. that we can follow and go through and make sure that we meet those criteria. And then finally, step 3 is to apply for certified local government status with the following documentation. These are all the steps that we'll be going through in this process. The first step, obviously, is that historic preservation ordinance. Once that is approved and we move on from that, we can go to the formation of that historic preservation commission. And then what we'll do is we'll provide to the state the copies of statements from the commissioners themselves, resumes for the professional members, and then a resume from the staff person who's assigned to staff the commission from the city. And we're not certain exactly how that's all going to fit together right now, but we're working towards that. And then finally, the bylaws and the rules of procedure for the commission itself. Finally, the next steps in this actual procedure of doing the historic preservation ordinance, we talked about that just a minute ago. The staff review and polishing of the draft ordinance text. Administrative functions such as submitting for SEPA review. That's what we're going to be going through here in the next month and a half. The presentation of the draft to the Planning Commission, which will be happening in January, and that City Council workshop. And then any further review and revision if needed. If, for instance, there's something in that code section that you don't like to see, we can work on polishing that, removing it, changing, et cetera, to make it more appropriate for what your beliefs are as far as how we need to be moving forward with that. And then going back to the Planning Commission if necessary, and then finally following through with the City Council approval. So that is pretty much the very nutshell version of what we're doing. Again, what this is going to provide is some assistance for property owners within this city, and again, specifically the downtown area, to get some possible grants, to get some technical assistance to help them renovate buildings and do it in a way that is appropriate to the historic character of those buildings. This is not going to be a situation where people are forced to come into compliance with certain regulations. This is not a prescriptive thing where we say, okay, you're now in a historic district, you have to do this. This is strictly voluntary. These are things that people can get from the state. And it's, like I said, it's voluntary. It's not something that we're forcing on people. And I think that was very important from the start as far as whether or not we wanted to move forward with something like this. So if you have any questions for me, I'm available for that. And I know we have our executive director of the Main Street Association here as well tonight. So,
are the properties eligible? Are they not just commercial? Is it also open to residential and government buildings? Or is it just commercial buildings?
that is a good question, and I'm not certain to the answer to that. That's a fine question. I can do some research into that one and find out. I believe that it is applicable to all, but I will definitely find out for you.
Thank you.
I see under some of the requirements for the program, it says that a certified government would be required to enforce state and local legislation for designation and protection of historic properties, also establishing and maintaining qualified historic preservation commission and maintaining a system for the survey and inventory of historic properties. I'm curious of what type of burden this is going to place upon the city, upon any business owners that may end up on that designated list, or to homeowners potentially who may end up on some sort of a list that then it appears that we'd be required to enforce.
Yeah.
I don't know what we'd be required to enforce, but I see a lot of benefits, but I see some things that allude to some possible drawbacks.
Sure.
But they don't kind of outline what those are. I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious what the potential burdens are.
The thing about it is, again, it's voluntary for a property owner to become part of the program. So it's not something that we're going to come up with a list of, here are so many properties and these are the properties that are going to have to follow these rules additionally. There will be staffing that is involved with the city, and that's going to be something that we will have to take care of. As far as how much of a burden that is at this point, we can't say for certain. We don't know what the interest level is going to be as far as property owners are concerned. Obviously, the Main Street Association is very interested in getting to be a part of this. Whether or not we have a rush of people coming in to take advantage of the benefits, like you said, kind of remains to be seen at this point.
So is all the staffing, is that Can it be volunteer also, or does it have to be paid, if you would,
Staffing as far as,
as the commission or
That-
that's qualified person or persons?
that I would assume will also be a volunteer type thing. Yeah.
Have you talked to any of the other cities that have this? I've seen that Mount Vernon was one of them, and also Langley. Have there's been any discussion with them cities or any other city that has this in order to sit there and see how it's working and what are some of the problems, the pitfalls that they've fallen into?
I have not done that yet. That is going to be part of my process as I go through and get towards the Planning Commission hearing in January. So that will be something I can report back to you on when we get to that point. For
And
sure.
I'll add that Gideon Kaufman, our city archaeologist, has been in contact with the city of Anacortes because they're also a CLG. In fact, I think he went and observed at least one, if not more, of their Historic Preservation Commission meetings. And so he had some feedback for us a number of months ago about how that process was working for them. We can avail ourselves of that and share that with you in January as well.
You know, I just looked over it real briefly today, and I was rather surprised at how many cities that are on the list. And obviously, I mean, you know, more of us are going to be looking at it further to also get more knowledge on what's going on.
And I think we saw it both in the executive director's letter as well as in the comments that Ray's made. As a voluntary program, communities are taking advantage of it, and then the property owners, so they can avail themselves of that funding should that be something that they wish to pursue. But if you don't go through these steps that Ray has talked to you tonight about, then those property owners don't have access to that funding. And that may be why, Cecil, why we see so many communities who have gone ahead and gone through this process, is so that that's just one more chance for property owners to access funding to do remodels and upkeep on their structures.
I'm curious if a property owner gets into the program, volunteers, gets some grant money out of it, does it then put them on additional restrictions of what they can do with their property in the future? Or does it just help them out at the time to try and preserve history?
My understanding is that it doesn't carry the same weight as we typically think of with a historic preservation designation. You know, for instance, once a property is on the state register, or more significantly on the federal register, then you're working with a much more narrowly defined set of things you can do without getting certain types of approval. My very limited understanding is that that's not what takes place through this program.
So it would be a tier lower than
At
being
least
on
a
that
tier
state
or two lower, yes. And one of the things that we looked at the staff level as this was being discussed quite some time ago was this issue of voluntary. And if somebody gets in, can they get out? Or if the prior owner got in and now the new owner wants to get out, can they do that? And it looks like that is something that can take place rather easily.
And I think the key thing is that money that you got as part of a grant would have to be spent in a certain way. But beyond that, I think what Steve was saying is going to be more the guiding principle. So,
And maybe this is more for our Main Street director here, but do we have any idea of any current owners that have put their hat in the ring and said, if we get this, I intend to make use of it? Or is that just setting the stage for people who may potentially do that?
I think it's just setting the stage more. So, some of the interest has been expressed.
Matthew, can we get you?
Oh, sorry. I apologize. Matthew Williams, the new director from Main Street. So some of the interest that's been expressed falls under what a certified local government could help with, surveying the local historic properties. Some of the funding for historic preservations, the facade renovations and whatnot, to bring it up to where it needs to be. The interest is there for that, but it hasn't really been proposed of inside of this CLG, if that makes sense.
So would there be a movement towards trying to bring the owners together, safe facade, so that we have a look downtown.
I think that's
And I
definitely
don't want to say theme, because I really don't want to go
Right.
down that road. but,
Right.
You know, bring it together, if you would.
for sure.
Yeah.
I think that would be it almost creates a sense of togetherness. You bring one up, and everybody wants to be in that situation. No one wants to be outdone by the other. So you bring everyone together and say, this is what we're planning to do, and go from there. Really.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Cool.
I just want to sit there, I know the one thing that I've seen since the infrastructure was done down there on Main Street, and, you know, that created a lot of problems within the city as far as citizens not agreeing with a lot of it. But under the same aspect, one thing I got to say is once the infrastructure got in, once the street got done, the improvement as far as the owners and stuff in the city, you can really notice the difference, because then buildings look a whole lot better than they did 10, 15 years ago. That's just my opinion as far as living here for the past 30 years. It made a vast improvement where the owners actually sit there and put the money in there to make it look better. So hopefully this here will be the same thing. And like I said, I'm not into the theme thing as far as the city goes, but there does need to be some kind of coordination within the city that does make it unique for Oak Harbor, not just a hodgepodge of different buildings that's been put together here. That's, kind of happened over the years.
Sure. Yeah, I think the interesting thing that he mentioned is that just kind of the concept of the rising tide lifting all boats, I arrived after Pioneer Way was completed, and when I came through the community, when I interviewed for the job here, that was one of the things that I looked at and I thought, wow, this is really cool. There is a ton of potential here. So I think that, getting a little investment into that, raising that tide for everybody, I think is a really great potential for us.
Anything further for Ray?
Just a quick comment. I think it looks like a great idea. I'm just a little bit concerned about possible burdens that we don't know about yet. So
Yep.
that's really the only thing in the back of my mind.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Please note that the next regular business meeting will be on January 23rd, 2018, and the meeting will start 1 hour earlier, 6:30 p.m., and instead of our usual time over the historic past of 7:30. So we'll see you on the 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Meeting's adjourned.
I like how you phrase it.